tonight, we do have a presenter, one of our newest members, and I would like to introduce his story. And his name is Harold Krisch. So I'll ask Charles, our Zoom master, to present his story. Charles?
Harold Krisch resides near Vancouver, Canada. He is currently Vice President of the Military Postal History Society, and a member of many philatelic societies including the APS, Collectors Club of New York, Philatelic Specialists Society of Canada, Forces Postal History Society, International Society of Japanese Philately, German Colonies Collectors Group, the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada, American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors and the British North America Philatelic Society. His prime collecting and research interests encompass the postal history of the Japanese prisoner of war camps during World War I. Harold has presented on aspects of military postal history at the Smithsonian Postal History Symposium, led a variety of philatelic Zoom presentations and written articles for numerous journals. His submission of selected articles to philatelic literature exhibitions have been highly recognized. Harold credits much of his philatelic passion to the mentorship and inspiration afforded by Emil Auer and fellow postal historians.
Presenting the 4 R's of postal history is our newest member, Harold Krisch. Harold?
Thanks very much, Charles, and thank you also, Andrew, for your continued work on these presentations.
Thank you.
And organization around them. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to present today. Let me just pop up the apologies. Firstly, there were a couple of colleagues who were hoping I was going to do a presentation related to my prime collecting interest, the Japanese prisoner of war camps of World War I. But I've decided to focus on my most recent publication, a monograph put out by the Military Postal History Society back in April of this year. And I've just decided to put it into a bit of a different context based on sitting on Christina Lake, the beach there this summer, and having a conversation with another person who's a non-philatelist. And they basically got me to rethink a few things a little bit and put some context around them with this question, where they were interested in knowing where my passion came from around philately. I paused for a moment and sort of came up with 4 different domains that fuel me in terms of my postal history interests. These are probably not domains that are new to any of you. I think hopefully the presentation today will shed some light on the context of my most recent work and share some thinking that's probably already there with you as well. The 4 R's, I have an educational background, so I usually put it into that context, and you've heard of the 3 R's before. My 4 R's begin with something called rabbit holes, something again that I think we're all familiar with. I think Gordon in his presentation last month for us touched on that as well. The whole element of research that facilitates our understanding, the important aspect of that understanding emerging, and the learning and the ability to make meaning and sense of things, and then to ponder further and reflect and find those aha moments, and then the representation of it, sharing our learning. So those are the 4 main aspects that I ended up discussing with this friend on the beach. And I want to put it into the context of my my monograph for you, starting with rabbit holes. These can be a heck of a lot of fun. They can also be very frustrating. Frustrating from the sense that they can consume an awful lot of time. And so it becomes important for us to be able to discern which rabbit holes are the good ones to pursue, and to figure out how you go about doing that. Some of these skills take a little bit to acquire and often revolve around being able to ask good questions. And for me, this was a cover that was instrumental in really getting some thinking going. And it's sometimes a single cover such as this one that can raise a lot of different curiosities, a lot of different questions. Originally, I purchased this cover because of the label and the relation and connectedness with American aid for German war prisoners. But questions quickly emerged around, should this postage really have been free at this period of time from Buffalo, New York, into Canada? Questions around this aid society. If you look at it, World War II, and you've got an aid society with the name of American Aid for German war prisoners. Just thinking about that a little bit in terms of what that fit is, where that would come from, and what might fuel that, and who's leading that come to the forefront fairly quickly. Would such a society not have become problematic in the United States during World War II? Then there's the question of the recipient. Who is this person? Camp leader, Camp R, Red Rock in Ontario. What could this letter potentially have been about? Some of the things that we may never get to understand. And then a myriad of other questions are possible. Who produced the label might be one as well. Rabbit holes can come to us not necessarily from an item we have in our possession or see. Sometimes it's what we see elsewhere, and that reminds us of that important place for looking at other resources. These are two books from my library, both of which I think are thoroughly well done, and both of whom contributed to this rabbit hole of exploring American aid for German war prisoners more fully. The book on the left, Bermuda, by Horst Augustinovich. For those of you who know Horst, extremely passionate about philately and postal history and history. Has done a really nice job with that book. And then probably one of the better books that I've seen out there on the right-hand side by Fairmont and Murphy, the Encyclopedia of Jamaican Philately, and in particular, this one, volume 9, was on military mails. When I looked at those books, the Augustinovich book on page 121, one of the first things I noticed was the two top covers on the left-hand side are both addressed to American Aid for War Prisoners, 16 Durstine Street, Buffalo, New York. In the Fairmont book, where he's referencing his collection, there are numerous pieces of postal stationery coming from the Jamaican prisoner of war camps in World War II, also addressed to American Aid for war prisoners or German war prisoners. And that gets one thinking a little bit more about what is this aid society about? What's it doing? It's involved, obviously, in Jamaica, Bermuda, Canada, and just beckons a series of further questions. Coming back a little closer to home, a couple of BNAP's publications, the one on the left by Stephen, the one on the right by Michael Powell, both of which, when I explored, also contained Stephen's book, page 58. There's a couple of a card and a cover, one from American Aid for German war prisoners going into Farnham in Quebec, and the other a card coming from Camp 30 Bowmanville into Emil Auer and the American Aid for War Prisoners in Buffalo, New York. And then when you take a look at Michael Powell, his particular book contains, I think, 5 or 6 images of items going to Emil Auer or the American Aid for German War Prisoners in Buffalo. He devotes 2 pages in his book to those materials. And so again, this seems to be prevalent and worthy of further exploration. Neither of these individuals really say an awful lot about this society and this association. Here are the other pages in the Powell book that have materials linking to Emil Auer and the American Aid Society. And Powell's introduction on page 369 is indicating that this is a less well-known organization providing services for POWs. Described as a largely a front for Nazi sympathizers, funding coming from the German embassy, and they provided aid for German POWs that were being held in Canada. There's just a highlight of Michael Powell's description of the Aid Society. When I was back in Buffalo, I decided to try and find out a little bit more about the residence or the place of business. I was thinking it was a business location originally. When I went to 16 Durstein Street, it's in a residential area, and it's a house that was built back in I believe it was 1920. Kind of nondescript looking. Has a small little garage in behind it, and the rest of it you see right there. The name associated on some of the covers, the individual name Emil Auer, born in 1904 in just outside of Munich in Bavaria, Germany, and lived most of his life in Buffalo, New York, and then later in Tacoma, Washington, out on the West Coast. Emil Auer was a professional philatelist from approximately 1930 right up into the 1990s. Definitely could be considered to be a humanitarian, and was probably also an outstanding naturalist given some of the work that he was doing. One of the other R's quickly turns to the research piece, and once you've found your rabbit hole and have some interest that's been generated, you try and find out more, and you look for more items. And so we often go to literature first. What can we find that's out there on American Aid or on Emil Auer or this street address? And there were definitely quite a few things that popped up. The article on the left-hand side that you see there came out of a GPS magazine article by Thomas Nally. And it was about a specific card. It was a fundraising card. It was one that was actually put together in Buffalo, New York by Emil Auer. His recollection was a little vague. He thought somewhere between 250 and 500 cards of this type were printed. As you can tell there, they were sold for 50 cents a piece to raise funds for the Aid Society. What's a little tough to see on the card there, and I've got a blow up that I'll show you in a minute here, is down the bottom left-hand corner. You'll note that the card says permit number 374, Department of State, Washington, D.C. And that's the piece that twinged for me in terms of this was clearly a society that was formally registered and registered at the national level in the U.S. And given that, it should be easy to find out more information on them as well. Right-hand side of this screen, this is an image from BNA Topics as a 1952 publication. Again, talking about prisoner of war mail, Canadian prisoner of war mail, and it contains several illustrations of materials either to or from Emil Auer and his Aid Society. So it sparks even further interest. Here's one of the cards, the fundraising cards that I just touched on that I have in my collection. There's about 7 different frankings that I've been able to locate on these cards. And as I said, ended up going to Washington, D.C. and spending some time in archives based on the permit number that I ran across here. And that was an incredibly rich experience. That's one of 3 piles of photocopies that I took during my visit at the archives. I ran across about 1,800 pages of information about American aid for German prisoners of war. And as you can probably surmise, that takes an awful lot of time to go through. I ended up photocopying about half of the total amount of items that were in the files there. And incredibly interesting material, a lot of it relating to the postal side of things in the postal history as well, generating a lot more questions, but also starting to provide some answers and facilitating some further understandings on what was going on, what was happening. One of the other things that I've certainly learned a lot from is the ability to not just delve into the research, but pause and take some time to take a look at what other people are doing. How are they doing their research? What is their approach like? What sources are they running across and advocating for? And I have to give quite a bit of credit to a number of individuals and some sites out there and the work that they're doing. This is, some of you may be familiar with Rob Fox and his blog on postal history. If you haven't run across this, it's one worth checking out. He comes at the whole notion of postal history research in a very good, concrete, logical way. And he's very good at asking questions, and learned a lot from Rob in terms of how to approach any investigation and research. Newspapers, great sources. Sometimes the unconventional sites can bring us a lot of interesting information. I had done some work with newspapers in Buffalo, figuring that that was a great place to be working. And it was in the Buffalo Library when their librarian said, have you used the Fulton site? And I did a pardon me. And so she explained that there was a site that isn't conventional, but has over 50 million entries, newspaper entries, US and Canada, mostly from the northeast part of the continent, and found this to be incredibly useful. I found some items and resources here that I wasn't able to find in other places. In particular, newspaper stories about what was happening in Buffalo, New York in World War II related to aid organizations, and help provide some of the context and background. So the learning for me here again was, don't just plunge into the research. Take some time to find out about methods of research and things that can work really well for you. Another research element that was incredibly useful for me was the process of developing a census. I ended up with probably over 320 items, all related to 16 Durstine Street in Buffalo, New York. And then how do you use all of that well? Well, a census certainly allows you to have some different perspectives, both quantitatively and qualitatively, I would argue. This would be an example just of my, my efforts prior to going to a formal census, where just a description. So this is off one page, just 3 entries. I used a color coding system. So items that I had in my possession and owned were listed in white print. Green were from items that came from publications or literature. And blue were items that belonged to other people and other individuals, or were processed through auction companies. I then converted this data and information into a more quantitative format. And this important part of the research again, so developed a census. This particular census is one of about 8 tables that I ended up putting together. This one focuses on the analysis of Canadian World War II POW mail going to and from 16 Durstine Street in Buffalo, New York. A couple of things that stand out very quickly when you do a census of this type. Where are the items grouped? 1941, 42, and 43. And so other questions come to the forefront. Why not in 1944, 45, or 46? And why not in 1940? Other patterns become evident. The preponderance, when you take a look at the number of outgoing mail numbers. 1 item in 1940 and 4 items in 1941. 5 items total. The vast majority of all of this mail is mail that's incoming to the Emil Auer address, 16 Durstein Street. Why is that the case? What's happening? So a census can be an excellent pathway to ask a lot more questions and to let you delve a lot deeper into those rabbit holes. I did the same for mail that I had from Jamaica and the Jamaican POW camps. I had about 145 items total. And again, similar patterns. Only 3 items of mail from American Aid for War Prisoners going into Jamaica, and 142 items coming into Buffalo, New York. Years in which this was active, exactly the same as the pattern established with Canada. And it was at that point that I started taking a look at what can I find out about what other people know? I'm not an expert in Jamaican POW mail, so who's out there that is? And I was able to track down, I went back to that book that I showed you earlier, the Jamaican Mails, tracked down Paul Fairmont in the UK. And Paul had about 170, 180 items in a database that he had been working on for almost 30 years. And so once I chatted with him, I shared the 145 or so items I had from Jamaica, and we ended up doing some collaborative work, creating a massive database. And that database became much more specific then for us as well. And this has been really helpful over the last few years as we started working and collaborating with other people out there who are interested in POW mail, and especially Jamaican POW mail. And this has taken us outside of philatelists and postal historians into the realm of people who focus solely on history. All kinds of opportunities to categorize. You'll notice here in the example from part of the massive database, I think there's now close to 400 and some odd items in this database. Extensive color coding that gets very specific and has been very helpful. A couple of other ways of looking at this. I took a look when there was, back in July, there were 366 items in Fairmont's database. 39% of those were items from the American Aid for War Prisoners correspondence coming out of 16 Durstein Street. So that's a very high percentage. It gives a clear indication of the significance of the Auer correspondence and what we might be able to learn from it. We're now into what I've called, the third group of R's, and that includes that revelation. What are we actually learning? And certainly one of the things I learned very quickly was the importance of collaboration to build a story, to facilitate understanding, but also to share and question each other on what are we doing, how are we doing it, what questions do we need to be asking. And that was a really useful process. Paul Fairmont has been excellent in terms of wanting to incorporate and build the knowledge base that I'd acquired into the work that he had been doing. So you now have cards such as this one that are now represented in the latest version of his book. And this is one of the very few cards sent by Emil Auer going into the Jamaican POW camp, leaving Buffalo, New York, this one, May 8th, 1942. You'll notice this is now 1942. This would be after U.S. entry into the war, double censored. It does have a postage-free hand stamp, prisoner of war mail, postage-free. The address, if you look carefully at the address hand stamp that is given American aid for war prisoners, but there's a large blank space that exists just prior to war. That particular space was literally carved out of the hand stamp because that contained the initial name of the aid society, and that is American Aid for German War Prisoners. So after Pearl Harbor, December 7th of 1941, the name of the society was changed and the German was removed from all of its titles. Paul Fairmont and myself, we started taking a look at the actual items from Jamaica and quickly discerned that there are some varieties that existed that had never been reported before. So we ended up finding about 7 different varieties on the postal stationery cards that for over 65 years had not been described or reported in any way, shape, or form. And part of that, again, is just attributable to the quantity of items coming together all in that one place. And that starts to make sense now a little bit more so because if you remember earlier, I had mentioned that Emil Auer was a stamp dealer. So any items that he received as mail, they went into his 25-cent cover boxes. And so items weren't being thrown away. They were being saved and they were made directly available to collectors and dealers. And he was a person who did do a little bit of traveling in New York and into New Jersey and went to shows and got over to Chicago and Detroit. And so these items and materials were available and were available for collectors. And that's probably the reason that you still have an awful lot of them that are accessible to us today. Here we go back to our cover that I started this with at the very, very outset or the beginning. This particular cover is very interesting. Mike Street will recognize it because it has to do with a short article I've just sent Mike recently for an anthology that he's putting together. The camp leader, Oscar Scharf, was an individual I decided to do a little bit of homework on as well, and became very interesting homework because Oscar Scharf was actually the captain of the Europa, one of the largest luxury liners that sailed across the Atlantic. Very well-respected captain, very well liked, and he was an individual who had some challenges with the upper echelon of German government and military in particular. He was conscripted to captain one of the boats that was part of the naval assault that was taking place against Norway, and ended up being captured by the British, taken into Great Britain, and then eventually sent over to Canada, and initially was placed in Camp R, Red Rock, on the north shores of Lake Superior, and then later was transferred out to Alberta and ended up in Camp 133, Lethbridge area. Scharf was a camp leader in both of those camps. He was very active in terms of communications around the needs of the prisoners of war. And as I did a little bit more research on him, his focus was not simply on, here's things we need for our POWs. His focus was often from the outset on mental health. And so his request for items was not necessarily food-oriented, clothing-oriented, as one might expect. His focus was on what might engage POWs in a POW camp. That would include games, activities, books, any other items that could bring people together and have them communicate. Things for sports, ice skates for hockey when he was out in Lethbridge. One of the other things that caused a bit of a problem for Emil Auer and American Aid for German War Prisoners was the fact that he requested a tug-of-war rope, and Emil Auer sent him one. And the censors didn't like that. They thought it was something that was going to be used for escape. And so there was quite an investigation done on the part of the censors. Interviews of Scharf ended up interviews of Emil Auer and FBI visits to his home. And so certainly that side of it was very interesting as well. Here's a camp photo coming out of Camp 130 that Scharf was in before he went to Camp 133. Scharf was always well dressed, so that's him in the front center, bottom row. And Scharf had at least several dozen communications with Emil Auer over his time as camp leader. Likely a lot more than that. And one of the things that was really useful was that he preferred using letter sheets, which means you have the contents and you can follow his dialogue discussion. And that was really helpful. I was able to acquire about 14 different letter sheets from Scharf to Emil Auer. Scharf ended up becoming somewhat ill in the fall of 1943. And ended up being repatriated via the famous ship, the Gripsum, in May of 44 out of New York. There's just a smattering of an example of some of the letter sheets written by Scharf to Emil Auer. Give you an idea of the types of markings on them. There are some reports, and I haven't been able to substantiate this formally, that Oskar Scharf was actually a person who was responsible for what is called the MN designation for service. And on the lower left cover here, you see the MN, which stands for Merchant Navy. Scharf did not want to identify himself as being Army, Navy, or Air Force, and those were the three common designations with hand stamps that were used in some camps. And he lobbied for the MN designation during his early days back in Red Rock Camp in Ontario. Almost every one of his letter sheets describes the importance of shipments that he has received, the impact it's having on people's mental health and well-being, and then usually asked for other specific things. He thanks Auer in one of his letter sheets for sending a paper press, which he said, which is very useful to the bookbinder, and the baritone saxophone, not alto sax as you wrote, for Giesendorfer, who I think has written to you personally. And then Scharf goes on to appeal for another saxophone because it's going to make the orchestra more complete. So these were pretty typical examples of his dialogue with Emil Auer. The last correspondence from Scharf to Auer was December 15th, 1943. And this actually went through after he was no longer supposedly able to communicate with Auer, and he just reflects back on the year and reminds Auer that he's really appreciated all the contributions, and indicates that he's hopeful that one day it would be possible for them to meet and for him to personally express that. So the contents of these letter sheets really reveal a lot more about what was going on here and give you an understanding of why the communications were happening, what they were about, what they were trying to get at, and what was likely going on. Here's the label that we started with again. A little bit further research on my part turned up a couple of items, this cover being one of them. Franked with the label again. This time, though, not canceled, not apparently used, with Auer's hand stamps that he was using for mailing purposes. This item hopefully to be directed to Camp E, never made it, because the prisoner of war mail label received a cease and desist order. This label that was printed by Emil Auer was only used for a very short period of time, perhaps only about a week to 10 days. Most of them were used on parcels that were being sent to Canada, Jamaica, and Australia. Not a single example has ever been recorded on a parcel or fragment of a parcel to this date. The postmaster, Daniel Driscoll from Buffalo, New York, approached Emil and said, "You can't use these. They too closely resemble a postage stamp. So please cease and desist." And so as a result, he had probably, according to Emil, he had probably about 20 or so envelopes that he'd already put labels on, but was unable to use. Lo and behold, the labels are again being used, but this time it's in 1946. So what's happening now? And this is again kind of interesting because the sender is the same person, Hans Neubeck. The dates are within a month of each other, yet coming from very different places. The cover shown on the bottom has an address of Box 300 in Bismarck, North Dakota. Box 300 was actually the mailing address for an internment camp in North Dakota. It was the Fort Lincoln internment camp. And Neubeck had been interned there since, I believe it was about 1942, and is mailing this to Mr. and Mrs. Emil Auer. Then less than a month later, March 13th, he's sending a very similar cover, same label. Postmark is now New York, New York. And his sending address is now Ellis Island, New York. So Hans Neubeck is in the process of being repatriated, has been sent out of Bismarck, North Dakota in late February of 1946, is now being held in Ellis Island pending further transfer. That transfer doesn't end up happening until 1947. So in theory, there may be more correspondence from Neubeck to Emil Auer. A couple of possibilities around the label. It's hard to know for sure, but speculation might have it that Emil Auer, being a stamp dealer, might have sent these to Neubeck and asked him if he would put them on some covers and mail them to him. That's always a distinct possibility. The other possibility relates to a comment that Emil Auer had shared with me at one point in time, and that is he said that once the labels had been prohibited by Driscoll, the postmaster in Buffalo, he ended up sending some of them out to people who were collectors, including POWs who were collectors of that mail. This goes back to facilitating understanding and revelations. What are the emerging truths that are coming forward? Some of the work that I was able to get out of the library in Buffalo, New York, the archives in Washington, some newspapers in several communities of New York, made mention of a U.S. government legal action for a group of people, 11 individuals in Buffalo, New York. They were going to take away their naturalized citizenship. And all 11 of them, as you could see there, were accused of taking the citizenship oath with mental reservations while retaining allegiance to Germany. Amongst the accused were Sophie Heigl and her husband. Sophie Heigl was the vice president of the American Aid for War Prisoners. And Emil Auer was called upon as a witness for most of this process and proceedings. 4 of those who were charged lost their American citizenship. the 6 of the other 7 were all associated in some capacity with American aid for war prisoners, and they were all found to be not guilty of the allegations and all charges were dismissed against them. So that was an interesting revelation coming out of some of the exploration as well. Here's something that I ran across in Washington, D.C. in the archives, and it's a return receipt. This was actually mailed. There was a piece that was mailed from the President's War Relief Board in Washington, D.C. to Emil Auer, and this letter contained this envelope contained a legal registered letter to Emil Auer revoking his permit for operating the Aid Society. And upon his signature being placed on this return receipt, the entire operation was shut down. The originals of this document were actually in the archives in Washington, D.C. So that was very interesting. Another reference that I ran across in those archives enabled me to actually track down this certificate. Further revelation of sorts, an acknowledgement and confirmation from the American National Red Cross to Emil Auer in recognition of meritorious personal service performed on behalf of the nation, her armed forces, and suffering humanity in the Second World War. This is something that I've called a further revelation. It's really a connection that goes beyond philately. And I think for philatelists, postal historians, in this day and age, this becomes very important. This is fairly recent, probably only about 3-4 weeks ago, where a LinkedIn post from Suzanne Frances Brown, who is a historian, former curator of the archives in Kingston, Jamaica, researcher, independent historian, and a person who writes on all aspects of World War II in Jamaica. And I found it very interesting that she ended up sending me an email, had somehow ran across my book or the monograph that was published back in April, and made reference to a number of entries that she read in the monograph and that she valued highly. She ended up sending me a personal email indicating that the thing she appreciated most was learning that she needed to be open to looking at other sources, such as those that could be found through postal historians. And she said there were some items and things that I put forward that I had found through the letter sheets and the actual items of mail that she wasn't aware of and hadn't run across before, and she really appreciated seeing them. And I think for me, that was an important reminder of that last piece of what we do, and that is the representation of our learning. We get a lot of joy out of the collecting, the searching, the research, the finding, presenting to colleagues sometimes via sessions such as this, but it is really useful to share broadly, to write, whether it's articles, short articles, longer articles, monographs, books, publications. And that's important, I think, on so many different levels, in particular, starting with the collaboration that it supports. I think the work that I was able to put together was better because of the colleagues who reviewed it, who did peer reviews on it before the final product hit, who raised some interesting questions that I hadn't considered before. So we need to be willing to rely on each other. It helps for further growth. And then I maintain highly that we need to continue to focus on sharing our learning as best we can to allow that growth of knowledge and to facilitate the understanding of how important postal history research can be for all others as well. this point, I'm going to thank you for your patience and allowing me to present today. I'll leave you with this particular photograph. That's Emil Lauer in the center of the picture. The picture is taken back in 1974, and the person left of Emil Lauer on his right-hand side happens to be a very young Harold Krische. I think I was probably around 17 back in that day. Certainly happy to take up any questions that you might have.
I didn't quite catch, Harold, if the camps were for German fighting personnel, or was it the same type of thing they were doing to the Japanese? They were nationals, or thought to be nationals, of a enemy country.
A very good question, Michelle. It's all of the above, and some of that depends on where. So in terms of Canadian camps, it was primarily German prisoners of war. There were aid packages that were being sent into camps like Farnham that were targeting those people who had been interned and were not necessarily part of military action. In places like Jamaica, there was actually a women's prisoner of war camp in Kingston that held about 85 women, most of which had been transferred over from various sites in North Africa, and 43 children as well. And so there were aid parcels. There were some aid parcels. Some of the descriptions that I found in the archives in Washington, D.C. were very amusing, actually, to read. There was one that had sentiments from a mother in the Jamaican camp expressing the joy that the kids had from all of the candies and goodies that had been provided. And again, Australia would be a little different. In Australia, it was largely military personnel in the camps down there. Bermuda, a cross section, everything from there were some internees again there in Bermuda that were women as well. In the United States, primarily military personnel in those camps.
Thank you.
Well, the correspondence between Scharf and Auer, was that written in English, or did you have it translated?
It's in both. Scharf was fully conversant in English. He preferred to write in German. Okay. I'd say probably 75% of his letter sheets are in German, but 25% are in English.
Yeah, because it's, you know, looking at what was written on one or two of them, he seemed pretty fluent in English, but I didn't know whether you had translated them.
No, he was very fluent, and the other upside was that if you remember from his handwriting is very nice. So it doesn't present any challenges in terms of translation at all. It's very easy to translate.
Harold, I want to thank you for an amazing talk. I do have two things. I do relate this to back before you became a member of the PSSC. When I nominated you, I said to the group that you have probably the most philatelic horsepower in this country that is not a member of the PSSC. But I can't say that anymore because now you're a member. But it certainly is evident that your contributions to philately are really appreciated, and I think crosses all genres and interests of philately, this type of presentation. And for that, I want to thank you. I do want to say one thing, though. In your last image with the picture of both you and Emil Lauer, could you let everyone know, and forgive me if you said this already, but could you explain to the group your relationship to him? It's a rhetorical question.
Thanks, Darren. Far too kind with your comments, but certainly appreciated. Emil Lauer introduces me as his nephew. And so I've been very fortunate to know Emil Auer for an extended period of time. In some respect, it's been somewhat unfortunate in that Emil Auer was very humble, and he really didn't talk about anything that he did in World War II. And so it wasn't really until about, what was the 1988 when we ended up having an extensive conversation that got into this area. And the unfortunate thing again was that was also a time, I think it was 1990, where he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and his memory just wasn't sharp. And so even though questions I was asking, I wasn't always sure I was getting good, solid information, or he couldn't recollect. But I was very fortunate that Emil Auer is actually the person who got me interested in philately. And he made it a game for me initially. I think I was 5 years old, where I would visit him in Tacoma, Washington, or he would come up to Vancouver and visit. And he would always bring hundreds of stamps. And what he said to me always was, you pick your 20 favorite stamps there, and you tell me where they're from, what countries they're from. And then he would sometimes throw in some other requests like, what's the capital of that country? So over a period of several years, he was instrumental in creating a significant geographic knowledge base for me. And that just continued to grow. And I was fortunate to be able to spend quite a bit of time with him while he was still working in philately. But the unfortunate part, as I said, he really didn't talk at all about his background and a lot of the stuff that he had been working on or working in. And I just wish he was around such that I could be asking him a lot of questions that I had, in the last 10 or 15 years while I've gone at this much more seriously. So
it's amazing. Thanks, Harold. It's amazing how this interweaving story from you as a teenager to as an adult interweaves with your own family history, as well as your philatelic research, as well as postal history. It's actually an amazing story, and thank you so much for sharing.
I had wondered whether there's any tie-in with that society and the Red Cross, and I think you showed a certificate that was issued or a card that was issued to Emil Auer, and I think it said the Red Cross on it, and I think it was signed by Truman.
Yes.
And I was wondering, when I first saw that, it looked like somebody had scribbled or doodled over the capital letters, or was that just an overprint?
Yeah, no, that's just the appearance of it.
Okay.
Emil worked with the Red Cross quite closely. He worked with the Red Cross already prior to World War II in Buffalo. And I actually ended up finding and locating some radio ads that he did with a couple of people from the Red Cross and the scripts for them. And those were related to blood donation. And then he ended up working with the Canadian Red Cross out of Toronto and Montreal in conjunction with support of parcels into the World War II POW camps as well. So there's a fair bit of correspondence out there with the Red Cross and Emil Auer coming out of Montreal in particular.
I collect not World War II stuff, but World War I for a mail addressed to the Moscow Hills Committee, which was a Red Cross affiliated thing for Russian prisoners of war, and mailed to Copenhagen. So that's why I asked the question about that Red Cross certificate.
Yeah, and
I would. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just a quick comment to Jerry. I know exactly of what you speak because I've run across a lot of those communications in terms of my Japanese World War I POW camp interest and the proximity to Siberia and the Russian domain, when you have a lot of correspondence going through there as well.
At that time, Russia and Germany were at loggerheads, so there was no direct mail going through. So anything that the president wanted to send was sent through that Moscow Hills Committee in Copenhagen.
I was particularly pleased near the end of your presentation where the Jamaican librarian, was it, the lady, discovered your writings and was surprised at the knowledge and the extra information she was able to gather from a philatelist. And I think that's an area we should all pursue where possible, is how can we interest groups outside of philately at the fact that we are historians. You know, I often compare myself these days to another scientist, an archaeologist. I have this thing in my hand. It's called a cover. It has something here. It's got something written on it. Went somehow. It bounced around. It did things. It's got ratings. It's got people and that sort of thing. And I think we could do the hobby a great service in finding opportunities to say, well, my article might be interesting to a geological magazine, or my article might be interesting to a military history magazine, or to here in Toronto, to the military club on University Avenue, and let people outside the hobby know that we do more than just stick little pieces of paper in albums. So congratulations on that. I think that's a tremendous move.
No, thanks, Michelle. I think you're bang on. I think anytime we can facilitate more of that work, and the refreshing part for me was that Suzanne was really open to further dialogue. She wanted to facilitate further understanding on her part. And then I think it was about 10 days after that, she sent me an email and she said, Harold, do you know anybody who does postal history work, World War II, for Bermuda? And of course, I have the contact with Horst. And so that was easy to facilitate as well, because she had a colleague who's a historian who's been doing some research on World War II, Bermuda. And so I think you're bang on, Michelle. The more we can push that out there to people who are outside of philately as well, I think that's going to be a benefit for all of us also.
And Harold, I have the pleasure, and I'm going to screen share. I don't usually do this, but I think this is appropriate this time. To thank you very much for your talk, and to see where going down those rabbit holes can lead to. Very informative and encouraging to see what someone can do when they really apply themselves to their particular rabbit hole. So thank you very much, and welcome to the PSSC.
Thanks, Michelle. You're more than welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Harold, I'd like to add my congratulations for a wonderful presentation. It wasn't what I expected at all. I totally intrigued. You had me glued to my chair the whole presentation. Thanks again so much.